What is up, Watch fam? Happy Tuesday and welcome to In the Metal. I am Christian from Theo and Harris, and today we're going to be diving into 6 incredible vintage watches from Omega, Rolex, Tudor, and much more. So let's do it. Okay, we usually open up with a wristwatch check, but because it is in the metal, and we've got these 6 new watches, 6 new additions to the watch shop at theoandharris.com, everything is on the table, so I have nothing on my wrist, but I do have all the options I could possibly ask for without being totally greedy. So let's jump into them. First, we've got a beautiful Omega Constellation pie pan. These constellations really have 3 major points to brag about. One is their movements. This is the caliber 561, but more importantly, if you take a step back and look at the Constellation model line as a whole, they were made from their start, from day one, to be Omega's ultra precise line. These were like the competition watches, the watches that Omega would put head to head with the best in the world. Now, although the Seamasters were certainly no slouch, it was the Constellations that Omega was most proud of, and rightfully so. Second, we have the very distinct pie pan Constellation dial. It really is hard to describe. I mean, it really does look like a goddamn pie pan, but what's so beautiful to me is the depth that it brings the watch. I really don't think that any watch, Omega or otherwise, captures depth as well as this watch does. But finally, it's those steel Constellation cases like these. Sometimes they're referred to as doggy legs, sometimes they're referred to as broken lugs, but whatever you want to call them, they are so distinctly formed and shaped in a very geometric way that is totally unique to the Constellation, and I think quite aggressive. And although you look at a Constellation dress watch and you don't, scream sports watch, this kind of design does balance the often isolating nature of those vintage dress designs. Those hard lines, I think, change that preconception, if that makes any sense. So this is a beautiful watch that I am extremely proud to be offering. Next, moving on, something very different, something radically different. It's an oversized panda dial chronograph, signed Jean Perret. Although today we look at chronographs as some of the more oversized, more aggressive watches, usually 39, 40 to 42 millimeters for the mass of them. In the vintage world, they just weren't. They were tool watches, certainly, but they weren't very large like all vintage watches. They were 35 millimeters. So many people do have a hard time jumping into vintage chronographs because they oftentimes are kind of dainty. But this watch is absolutely not. It actually measures in at 37 millimeters with 20 millimeter lugs. So it is without question an oversized chronograph. But if that isn't enough for you, there is more. One, this panda dial is absolutely mint. And finally, if you really look closely, it's those tritium lume dots that will absolutely just drive you nuts. They do, of course, match the hands, but the dots on the dial, they're puffy and they're even. It really is very rare to find them so original and beautiful. And I don't think it hurts that the red lollipop on the second hand works as quite a good compliment. Next, we'll be handling probably my favorite watch of all time, a vintage Rolex Datejust. This is a reference 1603. What is so special about this particular example is its non-luminous configuration. For those of you not familiar with the vintage Rolex world, there's kind of a basic rule. The smaller the detail, the better. Rolex produced hundreds of thousands of watches with thousands of different little nuances that most people would brush right over. But if you take a second and really look at them, they make a world of difference. So if you really come in close on the dial, you'll notice behind each of the indices, which we'll talk about in a second, you won't find a lume plot, and you also won't find any lume on the hands. To my understanding, it was these models that were marketed really as the dress models. I mean, they were just incredibly sleek. But I've got to say, the engine turn bezel really does add that level of sporty bulkiness that I think plays very, very well. But the final little detail I want you to note here actually is the indices themselves. They're what I refer to as broken. If you look at them, they're actually on a pitch. They meet in the middle. And although that does not make too much of a difference, it does in reflection. They're not blingy, they're not gaudy, they're not baguette diamonds, surely, but under certain light, they will catch and they will reflect just a little bit. And although it is just a little bit, it does make an enormous difference as the wearer, as the person, looking at it. With every little rotation, you see something new. And that, to me, that's just what kind of got me into vintage watches to begin with. That level of detail. So, yes, I am a big fan. Next is a solid gold Omega Seamaster, actually with its original bracelet. If you take a look at the condition of its eggshell dial, bracelet, case, and all of that, it may not look like it, but this watch was actually manufactured in 1950. And while it might be just easy to say, condition great, it doesn't really do it justice. Really have a look at it. Apart from a couple of minor scratches on the bracelet's clasp, this watch is basically as it was dispatched from Omega 67 years ago. Doesn't that just blow your mind? The fact that it's even retained its original bracelet, the fact that someone didn't just, put it in a box and the head circulate for the past 67 years, that's amazing. But it all existing is amazing. Then the condition, this to me is an anomaly. This is not something I see often, but the fact that I have obviously makes it all the more special. I'm an enormous Omega fan, it's no secret, but this is definitely one of the Omega Seamasters that I'll be talking about in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, as one of probably the best Omegas I've ever been able to source. And that's a very weird moment for me. Moving on, we have a two-tone Rolex Datejust dating to 1971 with a painfully rare matte black dial. This falls into the category which I've been referring to recently as Datejust magic. I own and sell a lot of Datejust. It's probably one of the watches that we here at Theo and Harris pioneered and have become quite famous for sourcing. Our standards are incredibly high, and although it definitely is our pleasure and our most common practice to find new homes for the highest quality, quote-unquote, normal Datejust, things that aren't necessarily uber rare or uber elusive or come with a massive premium, it does sometimes feel really good to say we were able to track down and own something that really many others do not at all, and that is what I have here. To put it in perspective a little bit, I've been buying and selling vintage Datejust for over 2 years, and this is the 4th black dial I've come across and the first in a two-tone variation. So yeah, that definitely puts it into perspective a little bit. And not only is it rare, but look at it. It's freaking beautiful. I don't think I need to say more. And finally, a vintage Tudor reference 7966. It dates to 1963, and just look at it. It's really quite beautiful. The dial reminds me of a vintage Milgauss with that vertical texture, but that's not where the aesthetic kind of value and detail ends. If you look at its hands, you'll notice that they're different. They are what we refer to as alpha. They're very full in the base, but come to a very sharp point. It's very distinctive of 50s and early 60s watches, something we certainly do not come across very often, but when we do, especially with original custard patina all around, yeah, we geek out, and that's without using the expletive I wanted to use there. I tried to tame myself. Yes, guys, we just sourced 6 incredible vintage watches to the watch shop at theoandharris.com from an Omega Constellation that is absolutely to die for. Top of production when it was made, and still till today, that desired. A pretty damn massive, by vintage standards, chronograph with a panda dial, and again, custard tritium throughout, a non-luminous Datejust 1603 with broken indices, something that I think you might have to see in person to really appreciate, but I promise once you do, you will. A 67-year-old Omega Seamaster that is, at least in my opinion, a miracle in this condition, an extremely rare matte black Datejust, and a Tudor that is something you're definitely gonna need to go over to theoandharris.com and look at Anna's professional photos of. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Scoop them up because they won't last long.